Could Donald Trump really be linked to the Antichrist? At first glance, it might sound like a sensationalist or even far-fetched question. But surprisingly, it's one that has stirred up serious conversation across religious, political, and even mainstream media circles. Right now, the world feels more uncertain than ever. Tensions are high, particularly in the Middle East, and as wars and conflicts unfold, questions around ancient prophecies resurface. People are looking at current leaders, analyzing their actions, and wondering if they might fit the descriptions found in biblical prophecy. Among the names thrown into these discussions, Donald Trump stands out. Some believe he could be a candidate for the Antichrist as described in the book of Revelation. But why is this? Today we'll dive into this question, not with a sensational approach but with a careful analysis of history, scripture, and context. The idea of the Antichrist has evolved over centuries, and its meaning has often shifted with historical events. In the earliest days of Christianity, the Antichrist wasn't just a person. It represented the enemies of the faith, often identified with the mighty Roman Empire. Early Christians who suffered persecution saw the oppressive Roman rulers as fitting symbols of this prophetic figure. Over time, the label of Antichrist has been applied to numerous leaders and institutions, often based on the fears and crises of the age. So, as we examine the claim that Trump might be the fulfillment of this prophecy, we need to understand the historical and biblical roots of the Antichrist idea. Is there truly a biblical basis for these claims, or is this just the latest iteration of an ancient pattern? To understand the Antichrist concept, we have to go back to the earliest days of Christianity. For the first Christians, life was incredibly challenging. They were a minority in the Roman Empire, often facing hostility and persecution. The Roman authorities saw the Christian movement as a threat, and emperors like Nero became infamous for their brutal treatment of believers. This experience shaped how early Christians interpreted the prophecies in the book of Revelation. The term Antichrist wasn't used in Revelation, but the symbolism pointed to a powerful enemy. Christians of that time identified this enemy with the Roman Empire, seeing it as an oppressive force that symbolized ultimate evil. Figures like Irenaeus of Lyon, an early Christian theologian, suggested that the mysterious number 666 could be a coded reference to the empire. He believed that this code connected to the emperor's title, hinting at Rome's role as the great antagonist in the Christian story. Rome was even referred to as Babylon by early Christians. This wasn't just a nickname, it was a deeply symbolic way of portraying Rome as a corrupt and oppressive power, much like Babylon in the Old Testament. For early Christians, Rome was the embodiment of worldly power set against the true faith, and they interpreted the language of Revelation as a reflection of their own experiences. This historical context matters because it shows how the concept of the Antichrist has been tied to specific figures or powers based on the challenges facing Christians at the time. It wasn't necessarily about predicting one future figure but identifying the spirit of opposition that Christianity faced. With this background, we can see how different eras and different conflicts have led people to reevaluate the prophecy. As we move into the 16th century, the concept of the Antichrist took on a new dimension. This period was defined by the Protestant Reformation, a time of intense conflict within Christianity itself. Reformers like Martin Luther and John Calvin questioned the authority and practices of the Catholic Church, sparking a wave of religious upheaval across Europe. The figure of the Antichrist became central to this struggle, with many reformers believing that the Antichrist wasn't a distant ruler or government but a religious leader who misused power and authority from within the church. Luther and Calvin saw the papacy, or the office of the Pope, as fitting the description of the Antichrist. They argued that the papacy had strayed from the teachings of Christ and was using religious authority to mislead the faithful. This interpretation was controversial and dangerous. Accusing the Pope, the most powerful religious figure in Europe, of being the Antichrist was a radical stance that challenged the foundations of European society. The Catholic Church responded strongly to these accusations. Catholic theologians reinterpreted the prophecy of the Antichrist to shift the focus away from the papacy. Some Catholic scholars even suggested that the Antichrist might be represented by figures like the Roman Emperor Nero, attempting to separate the concept from any specific church figure. This was a strategic move to protect the Church's authority during a time of fierce criticism and division. This era highlights how the interpretation of the Antichrist shifted based on the social and religious context. For the Reformers, the Antichrist wasn't an outsider but a figure within the Christian community who misused their power. This perspective introduced the idea that the greatest threat to true faith could come from within, not just from external enemies. It also set a precedent for viewing religious institutions and leaders through a critical lens, especially when they held significant power. As time progressed, the interpretation of the Antichrist continued to evolve, adapting to the world's changing political and social landscapes. In more recent history, different religious groups began associating the Antichrist not with a single person but with larger institutions or powerful political bodies. One example is the Jehovah's Witnesses, who have linked the prophecy of the Antichrist to global organizations like the United Nations. For them, the UN represents a form of worldwide governance that might challenge or undermine God's authority. This shift to interpreting the Antichrist as an institution rather than an individual reflects a growing concern with centralized power on a global scale. As new international alliances and organizations emerged, people began to see them as potential vehicles for the kind of influence and control described in biblical prophecy. In this view, the Antichrist is not just about one figure but rather a system of power that could affect people on a massive scale, often appealing to ideals of peace and unity but hiding an agenda that might be opposed to biblical principles. This trend of linking prophecy to institutions highlights a key pattern. The idea of the Antichrist often adapts to whatever powers people fear at the time. In earlier centuries, it was the Roman Empire, then the papacy during the Reformation, and now, for some, it is institutions like the United Nations or other political and financial alliances. These interpretations are a reminder of how prophetic symbols can be molded to fit the anxieties of each era. This modern interpretation suggests that the Antichrist is not necessarily a single antagonist. Instead, it reflects a broader fear of centralized control, especially one that might appear benign but ultimately acts against religious values. It points to the idea that as the world becomes more interconnected, there is a heightened wariness of any system or organization that could hold too much influence, particularly one that might conflict with or overshadow religious beliefs. In today's world, with increasing global tensions, the idea of the Antichrist is being revisited yet again. Donald Trump, in particular, has sparked significant debate regarding prophecy. Some believe his personality, influence, and potential to broker peace in conflict zones like Israel align with characteristics often attributed to the Antichrist. This belief is fueled by the way Trump has presented himself as a powerful figure who can shift political dynamics, often with a strong and divisive presence. Trump's role in Middle Eastern politics has been especially noteworthy. He was instrumental in the Abraham Accords, a series of agreements aimed at establishing peace between Israel and several Arab nations. While many saw these agreements as a step toward greater stability, some viewed them through the lens of biblical prophecy, questioning if a figure who negotiates peace could later disrupt it. The idea stems from interpretations of the Antichrist as a deceiver who initially brings peace before revealing a darker agenda. The concept of a leader emerging in turbulent times, offering solutions while dividing opinion, resonates with descriptions of the Antichrist as a figure who deceives and holds power over many. For some, Trump's rhetoric and polarizing actions make him seem like a potential candidate for this role, especially considering the intense loyalty he commands from his supporters and the opposition he faces from his critics. However, these views are far from universal. Many scholars argue that labeling any contemporary figure as the Antichrist risks oversimplifying complex prophecies and reduces them to current political opinions. They caution that prophecy is often symbolic, not necessarily a prediction of one individual's actions. They suggest that instead of focusing on single figures, it might be more accurate to view the Antichrist as a symbol of any force or system that opposes or corrupts faith. This debate illustrates the challenge in interpreting ancient texts within modern contexts. Trump's influence and the emotions he stirs may align with certain descriptions, but whether he fulfills any biblical prophecy remains a question of interpretation. What this reveals, however, is the enduring power of prophecy to shape our understanding of current events, especially in times of political and social upheaval. The Catholic interpretation of the Antichrist has unique elements that set it apart from other Christian views. In Catholic teaching, the Antichrist is often portrayed not as an external political figure but as a deceptive force within Christianity itself. The Catechism of the Catholic Church emphasizes that before the second coming of Christ, the Church will face a severe trial that will test the faith of its followers. This trial is believed to involve deception, leading believers away from the truth from within their own ranks. This view suggests that the Antichrist's influence could emerge from within the Christian community, rather than from an outside force or a political leader. The concept implies that the greatest danger to faith may not come from an obvious enemy but from someone who appears to be a part of the faith, yet whose teachings or actions mislead believers. This aligns with the warnings found in the letters of John in the New Testament, where it is written that many antichrists have already appeared, even during the time of the apostles. For Catholic theologians, the Antichrist is not merely an individual but a recurring force that symbolizes opposition to true Christian teachings. This force could appear as false teachings, leaders who misguide, or institutions that place themselves above God. In this sense, the Antichrist is understood less as a single, future individual and more as an ongoing threat that has always been present in some form, challenging the faith and authenticity of Christianity. This perspective is significant because it shifts the focus from identifying a specific person to recognizing patterns of deception that could arise within the church itself. It reminds believers to be vigilant not only against obvious external threats but also against subtler forms of deception that could come from trusted sources. The Catholic view encourages reflection on one's faith and warns against complacency, suggesting that the true danger could come from a betrayal of values from within the community. In exploring the concept of the Antichrist, it's essential to look at the New Testament's references, especially in the letters of John. These texts provide some of the earliest mentions of the Antichrist, and they offer a perspective that differs from a singular future figure. In 1 John, the writer states that many antichrists have come, implying that the spirit of the Antichrist was already active during the time of the apostles. This view suggests that the Antichrist is not necessarily one individual but rather a recurring force that emerges throughout history. The spirit of the Antichrist, according to these texts, is defined by opposition to Christ and his teachings. This spirit can be embodied by any person, group, or institution that denies essential truths of Christianity. Rather than pointing to a specific future antagonist, the New Testament indicates that this spirit is an ongoing threat, challenging believers to stay vigilant against deception. This understanding aligns with the Catholic perspective, where the Antichrist is seen as an internal threat to the faith rather than a single end-time figure. This interpretation has influenced Christian thought for centuries, as it suggests that the Antichrist is a recurring presence rather than a one-time occurrence. The idea that this spirit is ever-present reinforces the importance of discernment. Believers are urged to remain grounded in their faith, watching for teachings or leaders that might appear to be aligned with Christianity but ultimately work against its core principles. This approach to understanding the Antichrist highlights a broader warning about the nature of spiritual conflict. Instead of focusing on identifying one person or event, the New Testament's view invites Christians to recognize the signs of opposition that could arise at any time. It serves as a reminder that the battle between truth and deception is ongoing, and that staying faithful requires constant awareness of those influences that might lead believers away from true Christian values. In the book of Revelation, one of the most striking images is the woman seated on the beast, found in chapter 17. This mysterious figure has been a subject of speculation for centuries, and many early Christians interpreted her as a symbol of Rome. The woman is described as Babylon, adorned in wealth, and sitting on a beast with 7 heads, often interpreted as representing the 7 hills of Rome. This imagery links her to an empire that was seen as corrupt and morally fallen, an oppressive power over the early Christian church. For early Christians, Rome was more than just a city. It represented a system that actively persecuted believers. To them, the woman on the beast was not simply a vision of a future city or power but a reflection of their present reality. Rome, with its authority and reach, symbolized a worldly power that had turned away from God. This interpretation connected the city's physical power with a spiritual threat, one that sought to lead people away from the teachings of Christ. Over time, this imagery has been interpreted as a warning against religious apostasy, the act of abandoning or distorting true faith. Some Christian traditions have seen the woman on the beast as representing institutions or movements that hold great influence yet deviate from authentic Christian teachings. This interpretation serves as a reminder that power and influence can corrupt, and even religious institutions must be careful not to stray from foundational values. This symbolic reading of Rome and apostasy is not about condemning any specific group but rather about understanding how the forces described in Revelation apply to any entity that might lead people away from faith. It's a cautionary image urging believers to stay committed to their beliefs, even when powerful systems or institutions appear to offer enticing alternatives. In this sense, Revelation's depiction of Rome and the woman on the beast reflects an ongoing tension between spiritual integrity and worldly power, warning against any force that may corrupt true faith from within. As we've explored, the figure of the Antichrist has been understood in many different ways throughout history, each interpretation shaped by the cultural and religious context of its time. From the Roman Empire to the papacy, from global institutions to present-day political figures, the Antichrist has often been seen as the ultimate adversary, a force that seeks to distort or oppose faith. But this evolving interpretation may carry a deeper lesson beyond identifying any one individual or institution. Revelation's message can be seen as a call to focus on the integrity of one's own faith. By warning of the Antichrist's deceptions, the Bible invites believers to reflect on their personal commitment to truth and authenticity. This means examining the influences around us, questioning whether they genuinely align with Christian teachings, and staying vigilant against forces that may appear trustworthy but ultimately lead away from faith. Many scholars suggest that rather than fixating on identifying a specific Antichrist, the true lesson may be to recognize the recurring threats of deception, pride, and corruption that can appear in any era, within any institution or leader. This broader understanding speaks to the idea that the Antichrist might not be one person or power but rather a reflection of humanity's struggle with faith, truth, and moral compromise. In this sense, Revelation offers a timeless message that applies to every generation, encouraging people to hold steadfast to their beliefs and values in a world that constantly shifts. This call to remain true to one's faith serves as a reminder that the journey is not simply about recognizing external threats. It's also about understanding and guarding against the internal challenges that can arise when power and faith intersect. The story of the Antichrist may ultimately be a warning to stay grounded, to value authenticity, and to avoid letting the allure of power lead one away from a sincere, humble commitment to spiritual truth. Thank you for watching and exploring this complex and thought-provoking topic. If you found this discussion insightful, please like and subscribe for more content on biblical interpretations, history, and modern connections to ancient texts.